Last year, I started writing about this idea, sovereign Albion, because I felt that in a world of economic stagnation, geopolitical volatility, and AI takeoff, we not only needed durable statecraft and sovereignty, but also to revive something deeper, a spiritual, cultural, and aesthetic foundation that binds us together as a nation so that we can navigate these times collectively. One of the biggest inspirations for this work was Zakia Sewell, a writer, broadcaster, and DJ on a quest to discover Albion, an alternative national story and canvas rooted in myth, folklore, and enchantment. When so many people seem to be looking for meaning, and at a time when so many conversations about national identity focus on who to exclude, I found it a hugely inspiring project and proposal about what it is we could all be inspired by, proud of, and connected to. Now, having written her new book, Finding Albion, it was an enormous privilege to hear more about what she discovered on her journey. So, Zakia, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's start with an easy one. What does Albion mean to you? How did you come to it?
An easy one, he says. Well, Albion is the ancient name for Britain, and it's a kind of nebulous word or concept that means lots of different things to different people. I suppose I can't pinpoint the first time I came across the word. It was probably emblazoned on a pub sign, or I used to live in Stoke Newington, and there's an Albion Road which I live just around the corner from. So it's probably sort of seeped into my consciousness sort of slowly over the years rather than one particular memorable moment.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it represents this sort of alternative spirit of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's sort of in some of the early texts and kind of histories of Britain, the island is referred to, you know, the isle formerly known as Albion. So it represents this kind of time before.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, we don't really know anything about what the word really means, where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are kind of guesses about the etymology, but it's all a bit unclear, and so it's kind of shrouded in mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the fact that we can't quite pin it down has meant that it's kind of rich and fertile for dreaming about Britain and alternative visions of the nation.
I think that came through so much in your work. But it's funny because when I started writing about Albion, I had this like really bittersweet moment where clearly like, Albion also has some like contested meanings and connotations, and someone who like shared something I'd written kind of sent me a little message about that he got from someone being like, oh, you've got to beware, this is like textbook fascism. And I was so like, well, in one hand, I thought it was funny because the thing I was writing was basically like, rather than having a national identity based on who do we exclude, it's like, what should we actually be connected to? But on the other hand, I was like, oh, can I not use this word? It's like, how much do you feel the need to, did you have a blank slate here? Like, how do you think about the sort of like different connotations?
Well, it's quite interesting, sort of, you know, through the process of researching the book, you end up in all sorts of weird corners of the internet. And, you know, came across a book called Dark Albion. Okay. And I bought myself a copy. I really regret buying it because
You're on a list now somewhere.
Exactly. And I've given, you know, £7.50 to this, you know, this nasty guy who overwrote it. And it was basically this kind of negative fantasy about about sort of how the country has been colonized by immigrants. And, you know, people, one of the kind of potential roots of the word Albion is the Latin word albus, meaning white. Some people see that as a reference to the white skin of the true inhabitants of the nation. So absolutely, you know, people with very different views and visions of Albion to mine have been drawn to it. However, I didn't really feel the need to reclaim it as such, because for me, the kind of most strong, the most powerful association that I have with the word Albion is you know, via William Blake. You know, William Blake, the incredible polymath, for whom Albion was a kind of giant. It was a sort of personification of Britain, and he had this kind of very complex mythology that he kind of wrote about in various books and prophetic works. And he saw Albion as this giant that represented this kind of soul of the nation that had fallen into a deathly slumber and he kind of walked in this kind of in a kind of state of death. And Blake saw this as a consequence of the kind of hyper materialistic empiricist, irreligious state of his age. Yeah, and yet he promised that the spirit of Albion would rise again. And so for me, that is the kind of my most dominant association with Albion. And it kind of eclipses some of those darker visions.
That's interesting, because I think there's a similar thing, or that you've talked kind of about this in a way that I think I and many other people will resonate with. That is, rationalism has its benefits, but it's not like the only way of seeing the world. And there's something here about like, can you synthesize like the rational with like the woo-woo, basically? There's an element there that takes it beyond just the nation state. And so this is a book about Albion. It's not just a book about England or even Britain, but there's other factor there that you've been able to bring in. I'm curious, like on your travels throughout the sort of quest that you've been on, has there been a particular sort of folk festival or custom that you've been like particularly kind of interested in?
Well, yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think the most powerful sort of experience for me personally was Stonehenge. And it could also be because that was the final place that I visited. The book starts at the spring equinox in one end of the year and finishes at Stonehenge on the spring equinox. It was also an incredibly gorgeously sunny day, quite like today. But one of the things that I found really, really special, I mean, I've been to Stonehenge before, but I'd never actually been for one of these solstices or equinoxes where obviously all the barriers are kind of broken down and you can get up close and personal with the stones. But it was. Did
you still like? There's this moment when you get like dropped off in the bus, and it feels very sort of like, it feels very antithetical to the sort of entire like spiritual moment and spiritual meaning. Was that? And my hope is that like I've not been on like the equinox or the solstices either. Like it hopefully the magic is kind of much more front and center on those days.
Well, yes, but it's sort of like you said, it's kind of the woo-woo and the ordinary. It's like pagans queuing up for coffee in the visitor centre and like druids going past on a bus. But that is the magic. It's the kind of the ordinary and the woo-woo all mixed up together. And I think one of the things that I found really special about Stonehenge was that it was really diverse, like much more diverse than I expected. And I had this sense as we were all kind of like trudging through the mud towards the stones at 5 a.m. or whenever it was, whatever ridiculous hour it was. Like it was this sort of disparate tribes and nations and peoples from all over coming together just to watch the sunrise. Like it's something so simple and yet so kind of deep and profound and powerful. And really being there, I was sort of walking around the stones thinking, what's this all about? What does it mean? And thinking that actually, in recent times, the evidence has revealed that the building of Stonehenge was exactly that. It was, stones from the northernmost point of Scotland, England, and Wales, all kind of these huge stones being lugged for miles and miles to this particular site. And that kind of movement, that sort of sense of gravity that site has, and that kind of that idea of unity and a coming together in our difference. I think that was a really kind of positive and hopeful note to end my personal quest and hopefully to sort of end the book on. So a quiet ritual. It wasn't like, there was a bit of a kind of druid session happening and whatnot, but it was really just that simple act of watching the sunrise.
Do you how much do you go in for the woo-woo? Like I remember talking to people in my family and they were like, why are you talking about paganism? Like this is like, do you know what you're talking about? And they're like, no, you don't understand. Like, there's so much more to it in Albion, blah, blah, blah. Like, how have you found the sort of like the taboo elements of this? And like,
how do you... taboo.
Yeah, the woo-woo taboo.
I love that. I'm going to have to steal that. No, well, I would say I'm definitely interested in spirituality and I'm quite open to mystery. I'm quite open to not having to know it all. I like the fact that there are things that we can't know and can't understand. And yet at the same time, I would say I'm quite a rational, practical, pragmatic person. I would like to think I'm a healthy balance of the two. And yeah, I'm not, I know that there will be people who kind of are put off by, sort of talking about spirituality or paganism. It's not an attempt to convert anybody to that way of viewing the world. Rather that, within folk culture, we have, like we've said, this kind of the ordinary, the pragmatic, sort of like, really, like a lot of folk traditions really aren't woo-woo at all. It's sort of like blokes carrying like flaming tar barrels on their back, not necessarily to bring about a good harvest or for any fertility reason or anything like that. I like that it's a kind of mix of the two. I think that I hope that anyone who sort of might be put off by the kind of more woo-woo aspects of the way that I kind of set out my journey for Albion will find more kind of rational historical arguments in the radical histories or the other aspects.
Yeah, because like I think there's the end of the spectrum that's sort of like the woo-woo, the crystals, etc. And then there's folk traditions that are like of, by, and for the people, the masses. And there's a really quite radical politics here. Like, this is not about the state. This is about like communities building up their own customs across the country. On the one hand, in some ways you're doing a kindness, sort of thinking about making these paths and these customs more legible to people, creating these paths for people to go down. On the other hand, I think a lot of people might look at these cultures and sort of say, this feels like, I don't know, Merry England cosplay, like it's all middle class national trust, Morris dancing, cream teas, etc. For some people, this is just going to be too weird for people. But like, I think there's a whole group of other people who could overcome some like mental barrier they have here. How do we kind of, is it your like mission to kind of make this more accessible? How should we think about doing that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't see myself as some sort of like folk evangelist,
Priestess of Albion.
No, I'm not a priestess of Albion, but a humble follower. No, but I've just had this sort of weird fascination for a really long time that I did just think was a very kind of personal, strange quirk of my personality. And it's only in recent years that I've sort of realized that this does kind of have legs, or that there is a kind of an appeal for people outside of the kind of the folky scene, of which I was never really a part. I'm not out here to sort of convert people to the virtues of folk necessarily, rather to say that within folk culture we have this source of alternative stories about Britain, traditions like Morris dancing or old songs that have been passed down throughout the ages, strange seasonal customs that are performed all around the country. They are traditionally and have been the kind of expressions of disenfranchised people, the working classes, women, people of colour here in Britain and across the empire who didn't have access to high forms of culture or were excluded from excluded from the national imaginary. So in that sense, they're kind of rich. They're a kind of fertile source of alternative stories, and alternative information that we can sort of excavate and use. Not to use that kind of helpful when we're thinking about alternative visions to kind of balance out the exclusionary and racist visions of Britishness that are extremely dominant at the moment. So really, that's my mission, more so than to say, let's everyone get into Morris dancing. It's to say, here are all these other... Well, obviously, if
so low ambition, but okay.
That's just a plus. Ultimately, it's to say, here is one kind of rich seam of our culture that's sort of been buried, that we can look to and hopefully find inspiration in different kinds of stories about Britain. And yes, that could be the kind of slightly twee May Day celebrations in Oxford, but it could also be, like I explore in the book, the kind of traditions that are practiced across the empire that are kind of fusions of British and West African customs that also that tell a really different type of story about our history and heritage. So yes, I understand there is certainly that kind of twee aspect, the woo-woo aspect that I can see that has, from a lot of people, have quite a strong response to. But there are all sorts of other kind of radical and subversive histories in the mix there too. And I think those are the ones that I'm personally much more drawn to.
There's definitely something I want to come back to on the sort of new folk customs, but maybe just to kind of follow up on like that point there about the contested sense of like national identity that so many people feel, and I think I can definitely sympathise with. Of sort of you look back at like some of the awful things that have happened in British history, and you don't want to have any association with them, and I think it has it has complicated the ability to feel a sense of national pride for a lot of people. How did you explore this kind of through your quest? Like, what did you find?
Well, you know, this book is really an expression of my very specific identity. You know, my dad is white, English and Welsh. My mum is Black Caribbean, born here. And growing up between those two cultures has at times been quite complicated because in many ways I feel very at home in Britain. Like it's where I was born, it's where I've always lived. And it's, you know, there are lots of things that I love about this country. When I go to the Caribbean, I feel more British than ever, you know, and yet as a person of color, as a person with very direct kind of links to and sort of as someone who's sort of seen the devastating impacts of colonialism, not just on the, you know, the Caribbean island of which my family are from, but sort of within interpersonal relationships in my own family. Like, it's quite a difficult place to be. How can I reconcile these two aspects of my identity? And so an aspect of, you know, the idea of pride, I still don't even know if that's something that I aspire to, you know, but more kind of feeling a sense of peace about who I am and where I live. I think that's kind of where that's sort of the place that I've kind of arrived at through writing this book, is that I feel more at peace with it. But of course, you know, as you say, it is a natural thing to sort of want to feel a sense of peace about where you're from. And I suppose something that sort of I'm grappling with within the book is to sort of like, how can we name and be honest about those really dark aspects of our past and our present. You know, we only need to look at the kind of horrific behavior of the far right in the last year or so to know that this is very much a kind of a living, breathing problem. How can we sort of balance that and sort of, you know, come up with really kind of practical ways collectively to address these dark aspects of our history, our heritage and present, and our present, with also not letting go completely of hope. You know, can we find, is there a kind of national story that we can conjure collectively that can sort of hold the dark and the light? That is the question. I don't know. I hope so, but I suppose my book is an attempt to sort of start doing that work.
There's it's not the same thing, but my like on my dad's side, my granddad was German and Jewish, and then my mum is just from the UK, and I've always kind of felt strange. Like, I didn't know about it basically until I was like 18. My granddad never said anything. He was so worried that the whole thing would happen again. He never wanted to kind of out himself as Jewish. And you sort of seen in Germany, not that they've they have a far right that's growing and getting stronger by the day, but they did have a national conversation about what happened. And there's maybe something to learn there, because I think it also allows you to decouple and say, I think of British history as one that had some awful moments in it, and also some moments of real invention and ambition and some greatness that has nothing to do with any of the bad. And I sometimes look around now and see the country that is stagnating, or feels like a bit of a museum, or so many parts of the country, where I'm from, and across the country, just are not doing as well as they might do. And there's a difficulty. There was this moment in your book, and if I'm honest, I couldn't quite work out what I thought about it, where I was I think I feel there's certainly parts of our country that I sort of wish we did aspire to greatness again, but not in but I still want to kind of get rid of so much of what that manifested in previously. I don't know how you think about whether we can reconcile those two things.
Yes. Well, I think firstly it's important to sort of analyze what we mean by greatness. I suppose the kind of the greatness that I'm quite critical of in the book is the greatness of empire, of feats of engineering, of military, of monarchy. It's a kind of self-aggrandizing, sort of pompous sort of kind of greatness. It's about superiority. And that is a kind of aspect of our kind of national story and our national identity that I and many others find very, very difficult to contend with, especially when, we have, especially, my ancestors were enslaved by the British. So I know what that greatness was built on. And I know the dark underbelly of that greatness. And that is not to diminish the incredible achievements, creative kind of endeavors and works of British people throughout the ages. It's just that story's had a lot of airtime already. I don't think that we're in danger of kind of losing that. We've got Shakespeare, for God's sake, do you know what I mean? Like, he's not about to get toppled off the plinth. However, my hope is to sort of to bring things into balance a little bit. And it's also an invitation to sort of ask people, well, what is it that you think is great about Britain? If we're kind of rejecting those kind of inflated sort of visions of Britishness that are so kind of the visions that are latched onto and promoted by the far right or by people like Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson or whoever, then what is the greatness that what are the aspects of Britishness that we are actually proud of and that we want to promote and sort of integrate into a more balanced, healthy and nuanced national story? I don't think that the kind of the darkness has to eclipse the light, but nor should the light totally conceal the darkness either.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. I think that's totally fair. And there's an angle to this that you saw in the book that is also about class, basically. Like this is a story of kind of national history, but it's also one of kind of class struggle. And you write kind of really, really interestingly about the Right to Roam campaign, which is sort of like a modern day kind of manifestation of this struggle. We have a landed aristocracy that still owns so much of the country. You talk about kind of alternative stories and we can find meaning in place. And people have all these kind of they try and find these like root causes or root sources of like, what is Britishness? And it's like the values X, or it's like ethnicity, or it's like all these like, either it's divisive or it's things that frankly have changed over time. Like our values today look very different from how they were 100 years ago, etc. And maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but like the one permanent thing throughout time has been the land. And there's something in like rituals which connect you to that land over time. And then there's something in the Right to Roam campaign which feels almost like a sort of like a modern kind of enfranchisement where, the enclosures played a role in economic development for sure, but also, they severed connection to the land that so many people had. You write about kind of how we build our sort of right to belong to and share in the bounty of Albion. How do you see what the sort of next phase of sort of like rebuilding our connection to the land and our national story looks like?
Well, yeah, I think it's really interesting in that the chapter where I was talking to Nadia Sheikh, who's one of the Right to Roam campaigners, was really my kind of first exposure, or in any kind of significant way, to Britain's radical history. Right to Roam are a kind of modern incarnation of these kind of people throughout the ages who have fought to kind of make Britain a better, fairer place, from the Tolpuddle martyrs to the Chartists and, Kett's Rebellion, the Diggers, and this to me is such an important aspect of our history and culture that is totally, that should be taught at school. It should be a massive part of, it could be a really kind of inspiring way to think about who we are and who we want to kind of, who our heroes, our folk heroes are in the country. Why are they not on plinths? Well, because the powers that be don't want us to rebel against. And so I think Right to Roam are a kind of wonderful example of a kind of continuation of that legacy and that history of radical action and protest. That they're not, the examples that I've named are kind of mostly connected to acts of rural resistance, but connecting to acts, inner city resistance and riots in London and across the kind of across the cities of Britain as well. So I think one of the things that really stuck with me from my conversation with Nadia from Right to Roam was this relationship between our disconnection from the land, between enclosure and kind of the erosion of local identities. So the kind of the acts of enclosure that kind of shove people off the land and into ultimately wage labor in the cities sort of eroded those long-term relationships that particular kind of distinct local communities had with their landscapes and the traditions and the dialects that went along with them. And really this kind of sort of blanket Britishness, that the kind of contemporary visions of national identity that we have today, that, as you say, are kind of more to do with sort of nation state. They're quite hard to really grasp. It's quite hard to sort of they don't really have much meaning because they are so kind of big and unwieldy as ideas. That those sort of came in to sort of replace those more rooted, localized identities that were really about specific communities and their histories. And I do think that, I suppose, one of the kind of radical possibilities of folk culture that I see is that, you know, if we were to sort of come up with new traditions or kind of new ways of enshrining, new ways of kind of rooting stories about who we are in our local specific landscapes, kind of reinvigorating that kind of local sense of community and identity, then perhaps people wouldn't need these kind of wouldn't need to kind of cling on to sort of vast ideas about Britishness. You know, you could sort of be British, but really where all the kind of feeling and emotion is in your kind of like your local identity. And I think a lot of people feel like that anyway, but it's something that I feel like could be sort of nurtured a lot more.
I think that's really interesting because I think you write about this in the book, but I certainly feel easier describing myself as British than I do English. And I think there's probably quite a lot of people that feel that way, or at least that's historically how I have felt. And then the more that I have understood kind of some of these alternative stories or alternative practices and customs, like across the country, across England and across then kind of Britain, including Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, like you start to sort of see how you can have a connection to places because, as you say, of their locality, or, you know, there's a place that kind of my family and I kind of go on holiday quite a lot in like South Snowdonia, and we've been there quite a lot, or we've been there in, like, I don't know, in Devon, and you or the Scottish Highlands. Like, you have this like connection to specific places, and then I actually have been able to kind of extract out of that a sense of a sort of like emergent national kind of connection, I think, because actually I'm not in those places at all times, but the idea that I could be in a nation which all of those are part of, I think, as I have come to see, is quite meaningful. But it's interesting, like, you can kind of go one of two ways. You know, if you feel any sort of sense of like difficulty about how you identify, you can go kind of bigger, or you can actually go like much more local, much smaller. I think that speaks to, you know, I kind of loved how you kind of wrote so interestingly about some of like the new folk customs that kind of have also been invented. And, you know, you talk about like Notting Hill Carnival and I don't know, there's something, I'm kind of interested in how you think about like what counts as like folk culture today, because actually, like, if people are to find some sense of like identity in these things, it might not be in Morris dancing, but it might be Notting Hill Carnival. And like, how do you like, you know, not that we need to define this super strictly, but like, where do you think the sort of where's the boundary? Where's, like, how do we define like what's folk and what's not? Like, I don't know. Is UK garage folk? I kind of feel like it could only have existed here, so maybe it is.
It's quite interesting. A lot of people talk about grime as a kind of folk expression.
Interesting.
And yeah, I've thought a lot about it, and, you know, like, I've thought a lot about that. And I think one of the problems with thinking about grime as a whole, as an expression, as this kind of form of folk culture, is its relationship to the music industry. Because usually when we're talking about folk culture, we're talking about things that have existed outside of, you know, either the academy or the institutions, or kind of, you know, outside of kind of commercial enterprise. So maybe those kind of early, you know, grime freestyles recorded, you know, I can't remember there's a specific stairwell that I'm thinking of, where like DWE is doing a freestyle. And this was like back in the day before these people were like releasing on labels, you know. It was absolutely DIY. It was like little camcorders and things being uploaded onto YouTube, and people speaking about their experience in Bow and in the rest of the city. So yes, but then there's a sort of crossover point where those things become sort of part of the music industry, and then are sort of no longer folk, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, I think that.
Do you think, like, can I just like ask?
Yeah.
As there has been this like growing interest in folk, there has also been like there's a market for it now. And I'm trying to figure out what I think about this. As like someone who, was not aware of this like until like I guess like only a few years ago. And I have found lots of meaning for it through it, but that has required there to be like things that I can go to and things that exist and people organizing stuff, some of which I pay for, and like where that line is between like the sort of commodification of something and something just becoming a trend versus like still preserving the meaning but being able to scale it to a whole new generation.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's been a lot of talk about the sort of contemporary folk revival, and there have been lots and lots of kind of newspaper and trendy magazines kind of like, oh, Britain's new cool folk wave. And it's definitely there has definitely in recent years been a resurgence of interest in folk culture, to the point where it's on the Brit Awards, like Morris dancing on the Brit Awards, which I'm sure lots of people didn't have on their kind of hot cultural predictions. And one of the interesting things about this contemporary folk wave is that a lot of it is happening online, and it is a kind of revival of the aesthetics of folk, and because it's sort of largely happening on kind of Instagram and TikTok, it's sort of traditions that perhaps look a certain way, that are getting more views and likes and more. And it was interesting. I spoke to a kind of diehard folkie in the book, a lady called Chloe Middleton Metcalf, who sort of like grew up going to folk festivals, Morris dancer, raising folky children, but she'd sort of like, she's not on Instagram, she's not on social media, so she didn't even realize that there was like this folk revival happening. And we were having this conversation about, well, yes, perhaps in terms of sort of social media followers, yes, we can sort of see the hard data for this revival, but what about membership to the folk clubs? So I think that one of the wonderful things about this contemporary revival, and that it's ultimately aided by journalists being interested in it and brands being interested in it, and Simone Rocha using pagan imagery on the catwalk and whatever, is that so many people from different walks of life, as you say, are kind of being exposed to these traditions and becoming curious about them, and it's so much more diverse than the kind of folk revivals of the past, not just because of the kind of demographic shift in Britain, but because of the visibility, and that you don't have to like go and get up at 5 a.m. and turn up to some kind of town in the Midlands to see a particular tradition, that you can watch it in bed at home on your phone screen, for better or for worse.
You're not at all salty about that. I was there at 5 a.m. putting a shift in.
But then, I think, there's incredible, like recently, the first Black British Folk Club has just been set up. But I just don't know if that would have happened if it weren't for social media and this kind of perhaps slightly more sheeny, cool, trendy aspect of this folk revival. So I think, blessings and curses. I think that ultimately the people on the ground who've been preserving these traditions out of the love, continuing them, will carry on doing what they're doing. And I feel like once the journalists have lost interest and the brands are sort of looking elsewhere for their their cool imagery or whatever, like I still think that, I hope that there will still be a kind of a more diverse and a wider range of people that have kind of got the bug, the folk bug, that will continue being interested in and preserving and also creating new traditions in times to come.
Yeah, because there is like, this is going to sound so trite, but there obviously is something so much more fundamental and meaningful about where these customs come from, what they represent. And you talk about it a little bit, there's been a decline of religion, but people still feeling the sense of like something's missing, and it feels like there is a gap here that folk could and should fill. But I don't know, like, maybe you said a few times that like you're not here to convert people. I think I am, or like, or I feel like I want people to, I don't know, see the light, or see like get something from this. And maybe you shouldn't be kind of too evangelistic, but like, how important where do you think, I'm interested in kind of how you think about like why there has been this revival and how much deeper it is than just an aesthetic sort of like trying something new on.
Well, yeah, I think there are a few layers to it. So as you mentioned, church attendance is the lowest it's ever been. That doesn't take away people's yearning for a deeper sense of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we floating around on a rock in space?
It's a good question. Yeah.
I don't have the answer, but these questions are fundamental and they stay with us. So I think people are in the present moment turning to alternative sources for meaning. Like there's interest in kind of alternative forms of spirituality is on the rise. People are sort of like getting really into astrology and things like that. And yeah, they're kind of fads, and maybe it's kind of like it's like
I'm drawing the line at astrology.
It's lighthearted, but it speaks to a kind of curiosity.
Yeah.
Also, we've lived through the kind of peak of Enlightenment thinking and the kind of materialist, empiricist sort of hopes and dreams for humanity, and sort of seeing that it's somehow that project has sort of failed in many ways.
Yeah.
Or that at least it doesn't. It's an incomplete vision. That there are many kind of ways of understanding the world, ways of being that were sort of eclipsed by the Enlightenment's bright light that people are now trying to sort of retrieve from the shadows. So that's one aspect of it. I think another aspect is the kind of environmental aspect, which is huge. We're faced with kind of climate apocalypse. And so the idea of kind of honouring the landscape with traditions and sort of getting out into a field at 6 o'clock in the morning and sort of like doing a funny ritual with friends, whether you believe that there's any kind of great spiritual meaning to it or not. It's about a connection to the landscape. Like the following the pagan wheel of the year, or, if we want to de-paganize it, noticing the shift, the seasonal shifts, these equinoxes, the solstices, May Day. This is about sort of a kind of becoming more aware of the natural world and its cycles. And for me personally, that's been a massive kind of reconnector. And I think it's the same thing for other people. There's a kind of yearning to sort of reroot ourselves in land. And that doesn't have to be like the countryside, as you say, the kind of National Trust sort of visions of what that is. It could be your local park in the city or the town in which you live. And again, everything that we've discussed about Britishness and the kind of identity crisis that we're kind of going through at the moment in this country, I think folk culture seems to offer a kind of different sort of flavour of Britishness, one that's sort of eccentric and strange and weird, but a bit radical and sort of like aligns with people's politics, and it's also kind of mischievous and silly. And I think that as a kind of, I think people are being drawn to folk as well, for that reason, as a kind of seeing it as an antidote to some of those more toxic visions. So I think those elements all kind of jumbled up together makes for quite a kind of an appealing case, at least for me, to sort of at least pay a bit more attention to these other aspects of our culture. And again, you talked about the kind of almost like this sense of shame or embarrassment that people have about the woo-woo or about Morris dancers or this kind of twee Merry England vision of folk. But that is only one aspect. It's a very specific vision that's been kind of promoted and conjured. Like there are so many other, like folk in its broadest sense is just kind of like the culture of the people, that people just sort of like getting together and singing or dancing or coming up with a community event that they practice again and again. In that sense, like this is something that is fundamental and that can look completely different according to where you are in the world or who you are. So I think almost sort of de-tweeing, we kind of need to de-twee folk a little bit to make it more appealing to the masses.
There's something in that. There's definitely something in the de-tweeing, but also I don't know. I kind of feel myself kind of like waxing and waning on this. Because you talked about this kind of just before about like the sort of choice to believe or the choice to sort of be to sit and like not have to know and have a bit of uncertainty. And so, maybe you sort of try on some practice and you don't really know whether you really believe in it, but it can still kind of connect you to something. And there's something I think quite for people who are sort of like, I don't know, they're not religious or they've found that very hard. And then they associate the sort of choice of like belief with God or something kind of much, much more difficult. like I actually did go to church one time last year. So like, oh, is this what I want? And then I kind of like, there's something in it, but I don't know whether I'll go back. But then you can also go wild camping in Dartmoor and walk through a forest where all the trees are just sort of swaying in a particular way. And I'm like, are there spirits here? There might be spirits here. Or I was sort of walking through a field where like very quickly, suddenly like hundreds of sheep started just sort of like ushering me along this path. And they probably thought I was like the farmer's son or something. But like, I kind of choose to believe that like this was the Dartmoor spirits kind of talking to me. And I don't know, I think you can get something from that, I think, even if it doesn't have to come with this like scaffolding and history that is sometimes kind of more contentious. Like, as you say, there's been a sort of decline of kind of communities, and the way that I think you write about it so nicely is communities of place can kind of fill a hole that maybe communities of interest, no matter how valuable they are, can't always kind of fill that whole place. You've kind of gone on this journey. You've explored the Wheel of the Year. You've traveled the country. You've spoken to so many different people, and you ask, could a vital collective reimagining of our folk customs and festivities help us to revive the communal spirit that's been lost in Britain? What did you conclude?
Well, I have this dream. I have a dream. I was sort of like reading about, the kind of the Festival of Britain that happened after the war, and this kind of great sort of collective nationwide sort of series of events that were all about, kind of bringing community together and whatnot. And obviously the Festival of Britain had a particular flavour. It was kind of its time. And I was like, well, what would it look like to have a Festival of Albion? Right. And what if that was just like local people, in their little town halls or whatever, coming together and saying, what does our community need? Like, what event could we put on for our community? And so, if that's in Rochdale, that's going to look very different to, if it was in Stroud or elsewhere in the country. But, actually something a way of kind of bringing the kind of contemporary current communities of Britain together, and everyone, like, whether you kind of got like a big Muslim population and then you've got kind of some elderly, elderly locals who've been there for generations, and new young families who've moved in from London or whatever, like everyone kind of coming together and bringing their unique perspectives, perhaps bringing their own traditions and customs, and sort of collectively coming up with new traditions that could bring the community together. That's my kind of utopian dream. I think if we could see that happening across the nation, this is ultimately what these folk customs and traditions have always been about, bringing people together. Usually it's sort of like, it's the depths of winter or living somewhere that's really grueling and miserable and a bit shit, and just coming up with something fun for your community, and for no reason, not to make money, not because, there's not necessarily kind of rational basis for it, but just because it makes you feel good to sort of commune with your neighbors, and sort of, even if you're not a great singer or a great artist or sculptor, to sort of everyone to sort of use your creative faculties to sort of conjure something fun and beautiful for the people around you. Like, that's ultimately like, it was interesting when I went to Cornwall and I got involved in the Montal parade in Penzance. And, perhaps before I'd gone, I thought that I would just sort of experience this ritualistic, deep spiritual feeling while I was processing through the streets. And actually, I feel like that was when I really understood what these traditions and customs are about. It's just about people. It's about connection, people, a connection to place, and the sense of passing on something to perhaps those who will come next. And I would love to see the Festival of Albion ripple across the country, and sort of people recognizing that, yes, although our customs and traditions and songs and the stories that we tell might be different in flavor, ultimately they are an expression of that kind of human desire to sort of tell stories about who we are. And that's something that crosses faiths, cultures, continents. It's something that unites us, and sort of coming together in our difference. And obviously this is a utopia under a reform government.
No, this is a great
unlikely
call to action.
But that's my that's my dream. That's my dream. Whether it will happen or not is another question. But
I don't know. I want to make the Festival of Albion happen. I like
Any sponsors listening?
Fern, get that checkbook out. Yeah, thanks so much for going on, Zakia. That was great.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks to Zakia, whose book, Finding Albion, launches this week. This is a really special book in my eyes, and it left me very keen to do whatever I can to help make the Festival of Albion happen. I cannot recommend it enough. For now, let me know your feedback, leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts, of course, and thank you to the Centre for British Progress for supporting this podcast, to Podcast House for their production support, and to Simon Panayi for original music.